Gamer Show here, back with another video. Today's video is what if Duncan and Courtney never swap teams. So in episode 3 they originally swapped teams, but it's going from this point in the season to determine how the rest of it would play out. So Joe would still get eliminated like in the original. I'm just going to say that Chris decided not to swap them as a result. Episode 4. Episode 4 is Food Fright, and heroes would win. Mal wouldn't send Courtney flying with that one switch now because they're on the same team. He probably would do this to Duncan now because he's not the same team. Duncan isn't as suspicious as Mal. I still think Duncan would be suspicious of some off about Mike because even though they're not on the same team now, I think Duncan would try to remember where he's seen him before as a result. So, for me personally, I think the heroes would win this challenge, but Sam still hides breadcrumbs in his pockets for going out and gets voted off because of it. Episode 5. Okay, Move Madness. Episode 5. So, let's see. Duncan and Courtney, how does this change? Courtney would navigate her team to the end, so that if anything, they would stay together. Gwen would go around because she doesn't feel comfortable facing the bridge. Scott would still show off and would scream like the original. I should point out that Scott is now more focused on the game because... So, I think these two vote for Mike because he cost them the challenge. Zoe and Mike vote for Courtney. You're probably wondering why I haven't met Cameron, and that's because I think Cameron would still volunteer himself as tribute to save Mike. Is what I would say if it was an elimination round. So Cameron is actually put onto the villains team. Episode 6. So this is basically opposite of the inspection episode. So they have to collect the eggs, and the first person to get them across wins. Duncan isn't doing that arc of I'm a bad boy, I do whatever I want. So now he actually is more focused on the challenge. So I think the villains would just do better in this challenge because Duncan isn't trying to prove how bad he is. Obviously, him and Gwen have still broken up. Heather would convince everyone to vote off Alejandro. Alejandro would probably try to convince people as well and would still snatch it out from Heather as a result. So everyone votes for Alejandro, and Alejandro would be going home, but he uses the idol on Heather, so she's eliminated. Sucker's Punch. Okay. So episode 7. And Zoe gets a free point for facing her, winning the last challenge. Alejandro gets a point for finding his brother Jose. Sierra loses to Cody Jr.'s mother. Cameron loses his fear. At this point, Cameron also points out the wheel's rigged. Scott fights Fang, loses to Fang. Gwen and Courtney fight each other, and they get a point because I think Chris would just make like that. Duncan's fear wouldn't be the bird now, so I think Duncan's fear is going to be... Ultimately, I think Duncan's fear would be... I think Duncan's fear... I'm going to say it's the cardboard, and Courtney's fear is going to be the jelly. And Courtney overcomes the fear of jelly by... similar to how it was in season 1 by Duncan saying, it's okay if you can't do it, and Gwen encourages her and she jumps in. Duncan's fear is going to be the cardboard. Callback to season 1 is very similar to how he says, Courtney says it's okay if you can't do it, and Duncan is able to do it. Similar to how he did this season 1, I think Gwen would encourage him, even though they're not. She is still trying to be friends with Courtney still, and because that's 3 points to the heroes, 3 points, and because the heroes only have one person that failed, that being Sierra, with the villains having 2 people fail, I now think the heroes win this challenge. So, this feels actually interesting because the heroes decided to vote off, and I think as much as Courtney would want to get rid of Duncan, I think she would choose to get rid of Alejandro. He's obviously the biggest threat on that team, so I think Alejandro would get eliminated in that episode. It's merge day. This is the merge cast. Does it look familiar to anyone? We have the same cast. The only difference is Sierra is here instead of Alejandro. Okay. Episode 8. This is the regatta race. So, both groups are Courtney and Gwen. Mal still goes by himself and destroys the both losers together. Duncan, Scott, Sierra, Cameron, and Zoe. But Mal would still turn around because Scott being here, Duncan never leaves the boat now because he has no reason to, because Chef's going to throw the dynamite at him. Duncan's just going to throw it away. So he doesn't blow up Chris's mansion. Sierra would make sure that Cameron doesn't drop in the water for Fang. Because Sierra's here, Scott never falls into the water. Everyone takes a while, and Courtney's boat is seen to be malfunctioning, and Alejandro's in the original. And for some reason, Duncan was really slow coming back to the dock for some reason. Everyone takes a while, and this is tough because normally Duncan would just get automatically eliminated, but he doesn't load the mansion. So I'm actually more inclined to believe Courtney and Gwen would win immunity. So who do I think gets voted off? But if you don't remember, this elimination was rigged. So Cameron would stay with the most votes. And he can't save himself now because Duncan doesn't want the mansion, so Cameron's out. Episode 9. So in episode 9, Mal, Zoe, and Sierra go off by themselves. And Mal has to frame someone with the votes. But Scott is still Scott. He's in the cabin. So Mal can't frame anyone yet. So Mal can't frame anybody. So that's still a thing. So in Ezekiel, she'll find, I think the groups that make sense for Courtney and Gwen, Zoe, Mal, and Sierra. Duncan might actually go with Scott because they're the only 2 villains, and Duncan would want to make an alliance because he knows that Gwen is friends with Courtney at this point, and Gwen and Duncan are friends, but she's trying to build a connection with Courtney at this point, so she's not really with him at the moment. And Duncan needs to convince people that Mike is Mel. So Scott goes probably by himself because Scott wouldn't care that Mike is Mel. And Duncan goes off by himself. So now we know what teams the groups are in, who's getting caught. And I think Duncan would go to Scott and would tell him that about Mel. And normally, I don't think Duncan could convince Scott. But because he never dates Courtney and has no real interest in her, I think Scott would be willing to listen to Duncan, and Scott's not throwing the challenge now, so these 2 travels together. So, I think Gwen and Courtney get caught because they would find Duncan and Scott. Mal would push Scott into Courtney, accidentally kissing, and they get caught. And Courtney would just slap him, I think, which would be pretty funny. And Scott has a crush on Courtney. I think Sierra wins this challenge. Because if Zoe or Mike gets attacked, she can use her rage powers to protect their friends. Because Sierra is really strong. So who gets voted off in episode 9? Okay. So Duncan votes for Mike. Scott votes for Mike. These three, because Mel doesn't know about Duncan yet, and he wants to keep Scott around. So these three vote for Gwen. These two vote for Duncan. Gwen's out. Which is a shame because Gwen's one of my favorites. But you're probably wondering why Mal got rid of Gwen and these people. Well, he wants to frame Scott for the votes. Or Duncan. Zoe is his ally. Sierra's immune. That aside, Courtney doesn't like Duncan, and that takes drama off him. Who's the only person that's keeping them together? Gwen. Episode 10. This is the obstacle course. And basically, this is the obstacle course, and basically, who do I think win? Well, we know everyone else does. The only people we don't know is Sierra and Duncan. And the rope bit, Duncan was seen in his audition tape escaping juvie, so I think Duncan would be good at using the rope. Sierra is pretty strong, so I think she would be pretty good. I don't think Sierra would win, and I think it comes down to Mike and Duncan. Scott would get electrocuted by the rope like the original. Courtney travels forward now because she wouldn't try to save him. Duncan would try to get Courtney on his side and would tell Zoe about Mel. Zoe would be wary about Mel, I think, but I think she would still stay loyal to him. Courtney isn't listening to him, and Scott says, tell you what, I'll try talking to Courtney. And Duncan says, whatever, she's not even your type. So Duncan would get Scott to try and talk to her because he knows he needs her vote. Duncan tries to get Sierra, but Sierra is too loyal to... She's working with them, but she's not as loyal because Cameron's not there anymore. And Mal wins. I think Mike wins this challenge. And I just think everyone's going to vote off Sierra because she's the biggest threat on that team. Like, even if Mal wants to get rid of Duncan, he wants to frame one at Scott or Duncan. And Courtney's a non-factor. Zoe's his ally. And Sierra is the biggest threat of these people. Sierra's out. Episode 11. So episode 11 is basically the episode where the events are similar. So Zoe and Duncan are out together. And they're just chatting. He's trying to persuade Zoe. Mal takes this as a good opportunity by framing Duncan for rigging the votes. Scott sees this. And normally I don't think Scott would care. But he wants Mike out because he knows that these two are a couple. And if they make it to the finale, Scott will just get voted off. Like, if they got rid of Courtney, for example, those two in the final two, and it was just Scott and these two, they're going to choose each other. So after Mal leaves and tries to get Zoe and Duncan, Scott hides the votes and puts them under Mal's pillow, similar to how Alejandro did originally. This confuses Zoe, and then the eating challenge for the ice cream. Courtney would still make the chart, and she would draw Scott with the rat tail, like the original, which Scott would be offended by. Mike and Zoe would be hurt, and Duncan wouldn't really care, so because he's Duncan, he gets it. He was probably gonna get Courtney out as well after this, after Mal, and probably would have faced Zoe in the finale. So Scott would slip on the edge, would be at the top first and slip on the edge like the original. Zoe would get to the top and slide down, how Gwen did, and Mal's not fall behind. Courtney would ask Duncan to help her, and he said, why should he? And Courtney says that she'll help him vote out Mal if he helps her up. Duncan agrees, and she gets her ice cream. Duncan goes back to save Scott because he needs his vote. And in the original episode, Mal would still board the fire plant, and that's important because when Duncan, Courtney, and Scott get there, Scott would use dirt. Duncan would just pass because he would see it's not worth using, and Courtney would use burned flakes, and that's important because a bird pukes on ice cream, and that would still play out the same. And Chris would say the first person to eat all the ice cream wins. Courtney is out of the running for winning because she's not going to eat the disgusting ice cream because she does terrible. Scott would be decent, I just don't think he'd win. And Mal's a quarter way through his ice cream. Zoe is the only character left in this cast. And Duncan has been shown to be really good at eating challenges, so I think Duncan now wins and gains immunity. But I just think everyone's going to vote off Mike because he's the biggest threat. And Courtney did promise Duncan. Scott and Duncan are in an alliance, and he doesn't like Zoe and Mike. Mike's out. I think Zoe would be upset that he's voted out. And at the end of the episode, it was shown that he finally escaped his mind and resetted the button, destroying Mal. Episode 12. I gave Zoe the Yeti, Scott the diamond, Courtney has Duncan has the golden Chris statuette, and Courtney has the painting. I think the painting would be destroyed at Chris's house now. I assume Chef would now just be gone the painting because Duncan never was at the mansion. Duncan would look in Chris's house to find his statuette. I know that's a thing Mal's does originally, but it just seems like a decent piece of logic. And Scott would get the diamond after Zoe because Zoe has the easiest task of drawing the Yeti. Basically, Duncan comes fourth place automatically because I don't even know what the statuette is. We never find out what the statuette is. So fourth place, Duncan. And I think Zoe would choose to take Scott to the finale because Scott would be an easy opponent to beat over Courtney. And Courtney's out. Meaning the winners of the season is Scott and Zoe. And funny enough, Scott, who actually came third in the original, became a finalist because Duncan and Courtney never swapped teams. So, ultimately, this is the final episode, the race to the top. So, the helpers are random element. I have no way of knowing what the helpers would get, who they'd get. So Scott and Zoe getting it winning ending for each. In Scott's winning ending, he pulls out the sword and is finally happy that he won a season. He's delighted with himself. And Zoe's winning ending is very similar to Cam. So that's all I have this theory. Thank you guys for watching. This is the elimination order and how I think we're going to go from this point in the season. Thank you guys for watching. Peace and farewell.